Now, if you spend more than 5 minutes in my comment section, you'll realise that there are certain patterns of behaviour that repeat. A lot of it is very positive, and I do appreciate it. So I know it's the thing to say, like, subscribe and comment, but I actually do read pretty much every comment that goes in there. And even the really negative ones, or the ones that are phrased in ways that may be hurtful. I read all of it, and you know, it's water off a duck's back, but the fact is I do get a lot of value out of it. But there are sometimes just kind of patterns that form. There are comments that people make that just seem to happen over and over again, some of which is true and is just, you know, just they're spitting facts, fair enough, but some of it is a little bit daft, let's say. So we're going to dig into one of those today, and it's the one where anytime we talk about World War II stuff, there's always somebody who's got to go on about why the British were idiots because they stuck with .303 ammunition and the Americans were super geniuses with their 50 cals and so on, and why did the British stick to rifle rounds when they should have been using manly 50 BMGs. Now, don't get me wrong, the 15 BMG is a hell of a weapon, but there's actually some pretty sound logical reasoning behind it, and that's what we're going to get into today. Or at least we are. If you know you're watching this on YouTube, then you're going to see the rest of the video. If you're watching this on Reels or you're watching it in TikTok, then that's pretty much where it comes to a head. So you're just going to be forever wondering what that reason is. But you know, I might drop it in shorts and then drip feed it in later. But if you want to just get it all in one dose, you know where to go. Anyway, let's get into it, and let's start by talking about this thing, the F-86 Sabre, which, you know, the British get a load of guff about why were they using .303 when the Americans are using 50 cals, but then the Americans had their dose of karma because then they got a load of stick by all the Vatniks who go on about why does this use 50 cals when the Russians are using manly 37mm cannons. It's all about cannons. Well, yeah, you know, I mean, they have a certain degree of a point, but mostly it's based on a nonsense understanding of why these things were going on. There was good reasons why the Americans stuck with 50s in this. There was good reasons why the Russians used cannons in the MiGs, and there was very much good reasons why the British used .303 rounds in the Second World War as long as they did. So let's start with the Americans. Let's get into why did they stick with 50 cal rounds in this aircraft. Now, as it goes, they actually did try this with cannons. They put Hispano, I think they were Hispanos, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. They tried 20mm cannons on this, and the problem they hit was a similar problem to the Hawker Hunter. And that was that if you put cannons here and you fire these cannons, they blast out a nice big meaty round, but they also blast out a whole load of burnt gases and so on, and you know, burnt propellant, and all of that gas gets blasted forwards and then sucked straight in here, or rather blown in, because that's how pressure works. But all of that gets into the air intake, and the trouble with that is that's not oxygen, and this needs oxygen in order to ignite the fuel and to do the going. So if you don't have the oxygen, you don't have the fuel igniting, it doesn't do the going, and that's bad if you're in the middle of a dogfight. So the problem was cannons were putting too much gas in here and causing compressor stalls. So that's one of the reasons why this doesn't use cannons, but there's actually some more intelligent reasons. It was essentially the same problem that this faced, the Hawker Hunter, because it's got the 4 cannons on the front here, and gas was being shoved out of these cannons as they fired off their rounds and going straight into the air intakes on the wing. Now, they managed to modify it and monkeyed around with it until that wasn't a problem, but it was initially a problem. So that was kind of a known thing. And oh, what's that? I'm wearing a jumper with a Hunter on the back of it. Yeah, this is as close as an ad read is going to happen in this video. Driven Designs, they sent me a couple of hoodies. I like them. They've got a Hunter on the back. They've got various different ones for different aircraft. I've got one with a Hunter and I've got one with the Tonka on it. Yeah, it's a nice hoodie. But anyway, I'm not getting into ad reads. There'll be no Raid Shadow Legends reads on this channel. There might be some of the other stuff. It depends. I mean, I'm not into this for the money, really. It's just a bit of fun. But I'm going to try and avoid getting too down that route of doing ad reads, because if it's not relevant or interesting or useful to the people watching this, then it's not why I do it, so I'm not going to waste your time. Anyway, Hunter, the most magnificent jet ever made. Shut up. Anyway, back to this thing and its 50 cals. So, the USAF, when they commissioned this thing, when it was in development, what they wanted out of their weapons was range, accuracy, and reliability. And to be fair, the M2 Browning had those things. It was an accurate weapon. It was incredibly tested, and it had been used in the aircraft role. It had been used in various different roles to great success, and it was very, very much a proven weapon. I mean, you can't really argue. The fact is, it's still very much widely in use now. It's the standard 50 cal platform for most of the NATO countries. So on that score, yeah, it had everything it needed. And then coupled with the fact that this had a new range finding radar to match that accuracy, it meant that this could engage things at range using the 50 cals, and it would give it that edge. Now, in common with the Brits, and a bit of foreshadowing for what's coming later, one of the things that they figured was that the 50 cal still had pretty decent armour penetration, and you could use armour penetrating rounds with it and that kind of thing. So having 6 reliable, definitely going to fire things that were firing out more shots was better than having 1 or 2 that were not necessarily as reliable and were firing out big chunks. Now, in fairness, a little point of note, because this is something that comes up quite a lot in the comments as well. This was designed for aerial combat. This was designed to fight other fighter aircraft. The MiG-15 was designed to shoot down bombers. So the reason the Russians went with cannons in that was because they wanted something that could punch really hard against big aircraft and take them out of the sky quickly and not leave them to limp on and hit their target or whatever else. So they went with cannon rounds because they were fighting bombers, whereas this was specifically going after other small aircraft. And, you know, arguably it could go up against other things, but its primary role was to dogfight and be air superiority. So that's why they went with the 50 cals, and that's why the Russians, with their MiG-15s and the MiG-17s, they went with cannon rounds because they had a different goal in mind. Now, what ended up happening was that the Russian MiG pilots figured out quite quickly that at range, this thing could actually do more damage more accurately. So the only way to really take on this was to get in close to it and to kind of try and remove down that advantage, which is why a lot of the combat footage you see tends to be these mixing it up at fairly close range. That and the fact that if you have got a fairly limited amount of ammo, you're best making sure you can definitely hit something rather than just like firing off into the sunset and hoping it collects some kind of hits. But the point is, the ethos was having 6 machine guns, firing 50 cal rounds was better than having less ammunition at a slower firing rate, firing bigger chunks of metal. So that was the ethos behind that. Now, one of these was actually heading out over the China Seas, and it didn't have an American in the cockpit. It had a pilot from the Republic of China's Air Force, and it had, the weapon was actually mounted on the side, around about there, and they were quite hastily mounted, but it turned out they were fairly easy to fit them to these things. And that weapon was also American. It was an AIM-9 Sidewinder, and this was the first, well, not this specific one, but the F-86 was the first aircraft to fire a mass-produced guided missile, because there had been other aircraft that had fired unguided missiles, but this was the first one to fire a guided missile that took down another aircraft. And that changed everything, because up until that point, guns had really ruled the roost. Guns, cannons, that's what it was all about. But this was a new dawn of a new era. The problem for the Americans was, though, that although they kind of used this proxy war opportunity to test out their kit against Russian kit, unfortunately, one of them came off the rail and just made itself a little cargo hold in the side of a MiG-17, instead of going off alongside the MiG-17 like it was supposed to, because AIM-9s, they don't actually hit the aircraft and go off, they come alongside it and they blast like a disc cutter of explosive and bits of metal and essentially chop the aircraft in half. It didn't go off, and it hit the aircraft and embedded itself in the aircraft. Now, that MiG-17 went on to land in a Chinese PLA airbase, and some Russian technicians, muttering the mantra of bomb techs everywhere, which is, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, they took it off the aircraft, took it apart, reverse engineered it, and then this happened. It turned up on mounts on wings on aircraft like this, the MiG-21. Well, it was MiG-17s originally, but it was the AA-2 Atoll, and it was essentially a Russian clone of the AIM-9. And at that point, the Russians had guided missiles, the Americans had guided missiles, and everybody they were fighting proxy wars through started getting guided missiles, and the landscape of air warfare was changed for good. But anyway, back to the Brits. Why were they using their piddly little 303s when the Americans had their big manly 50 cals? Now, here's the thing with history. It's very easy to clump together whole loads of events into single lumps of history and not to give them the granularity they need to really understand what was going on. And this is quite a good example of that, because it's very easy to look at the American successes of like the Mustangs and so on with the 50 cals and how effective they were, and then look at the Brits and go, but they were using 303s and they did through the war. But they did use them through the war, but they didn't entirely use them. But there was a good reason why they never adopted the 50 caliber. Because the thing is, the Americans didn't turn up until 42, and in 42, although Marduce itself was quite a reliable and sturdy battle-tested piece of kit, it wasn't very reliable in aircraft, and they had a lot of trouble from 42 towards even the beginning of 43 getting the 50 cal into aircraft wings and making it reliable and making it fire effectively. They also had a lot of trouble with cannons, apparently on the what were they called? Hispano somethings. Anyway, on some of the 20mm American cannons, they had a problem with the firing pin wasn't hitting into the back of the primer, into the igniter on the back of the shell hard enough, and they were having trouble with them jamming. So America didn't enter the war with effective 50 cals and so on, and you know, these perfect aircraft. They had a lot of troubles. But the thing is, for the British, they were making these decisions in 1939 and before, when the 50 cal wasn't even a thing. So part of it is down to the fact that the 50 cal just simply wasn't an option. The only option that the British had was the Vickers. Now, there was a 50 caliber version of the Vickers, but for one, it wasn't fitting in a wing. It just wasn't. Two, it was underpowered, and notoriously so. Although reliability is, again, one of those things, you're kind of looking at the entire history of a weapon and having to pick certain points of it. The fact is, in the capacity of an aircraft-mounted weapon, it wasn't reliable. And even the Navy, they were using them as a close-in-air support weapon, anti-aircraft weapon. And in that capacity, they quite quickly moved to 20mm because they found it just wasn't reliable enough and it wasn't effective enough. So that's reason one for the British. There just wasn't a 50 caliber weapon available. So the decision was made that they weren't going to adopt 20mm because there wasn't a reliable 20mm option. They were just going to go with 303s. And this comes on to reason two. Reason two is that aircraft that they were coming up against at the time, this was early war era, so they didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. A lot of them, in fact nearly all of them, were unarmoured. They didn't have the defensive capability. So if you fire a 303 round at it, or you fire a 50 cal round at it, the 303 makes a hole in the aircraft, and then the 50 cal makes a slightly bigger hole in the aircraft. So the trade-off of having faster firing with more ammunition and more shots, that made more sense to have that than to fire something that had less ammunition and reliability issues. And on top of that, in those early aircraft, the fact is what you were trying to do was to hit something vital, which was either fuel lines or coolant lines, that kind of thing, delicate engine parts, or, how can I say this without getting the count issue, the wetware that was in charge of guiding the aircraft and where it was going to drop its munitions. And the fact is, if a 50 cal round or a 303 hits some of that wetware, it tends to do enough catastrophic damage to make it not able to perform its function. I hope I've euphemismed my way through that without causing trouble, but the fact is that was what they were aiming to. So the idea was, if you had a turret that had 4 303 weapons in it, that were reliable, because the 303 machine guns they were firing were much more reliable than the 50s they had available, and you were firing 4 lots of machine guns instead of 1 lot of 50 cal, then you were just more likely to hit something and to cause that catastrophic damage, to cause that aircraft to be knocked out of the fight. So that was another reason why they did it. And of course, one of the other reasons that was really relevant was, it's kind of hard to imagine, in fact it was hard to imagine even in 1942 by the time they'd scaled up so much. But in 1918, at the end of the First World War, the British Army was considerably bigger than the American Army, especially if you take into account all the Commonwealth troops and everything else. The British Army was a 3-point-something million, and the US Army was just over 2 million. And the British had been fighting for 4 years, whereas the Americans came into the First World War quite late on. So the British had been producing munitions and they'd been producing arms and everything else. So by the end of the First World War, they had reliable 303 machine guns, but they also had a hell of a lot of 303 ammunition. So it made more sense to repurpose those like millions of rounds of ammunition and to reuse those in reliable weapons. It made more sense to do that than to try and decommission those rounds and then rebuild them as a larger caliber into a weapon that wasn't reliable and so on. So it was in some ways pure economics. They had tons of this ammunition, and the fastest route from it to putting it into bad guys was to just employ it straight into turrets on machine guns on aircraft. So then, as the war progressed and the needs changed, aircraft started having self-sealing fuel tanks. Armour was much more common on aircraft, and they needed better, more penetrating rounds. The British opted to go towards cannons and started using that as their solution, and just basically skipped a step, went straight past 50 caliber and straight into using cannon rounds, which kind of made logical sense. There wasn't a lot of resource. They had to focus the resource they had into getting the most literal bang for their buck. Of course, largely thanks to the exploits of this guy, after the 50s, no one was ever going to be using guns again, and it was all going to be missiles and nothing else. Isn't that right, Mr. Phantom? Yeah, you live and learn, don't you? Anyway, that's all I've got to say on the matter. So when you see people saying, "Oh my God, 303 rounds, why were they firing these puny bullets?" That's why. There was quite a lot of logistical and logical reasons as to why they would do that. And it's the same thing with why the Americans used 50 cals. Part of it was they had a hell of a lot of 50 cal ammunition, so it made sense to, put it to good use. So that's largely why. That's the story of it, and that's all I got to say on the matter. So now you can head off and go get yourself a hoodie. They're quite nice. I like them. Quite warm as well. It's bloody freezing today.